Just a quick disclaimer for this episode that Michael had to bounce before we could record a full episode. So he is doing all the quotes for us for this one, and I am doing the rest of the episode solo, but I hope it's still enjoyable, and he will be back with us in the following episode, live and in person with our usual interactions.
Hello and welcome to Fabula Celtica, a Celtic Studies podcast.
With Tyler Baxter
and Michael Frim.
Season 1, Ancient Ireland. Episode 7, The Coming of the Faith.
O Con, the Hundred Fighter, thou shouldst not cling to Druidry. It will not be long before there will come to give judgments on the broad strand a righteous one, with many wonderful companies. Soon his law will reach you. He will annihilate the false law of the Druids in the sight of the black magic demon, i.e. the devil.
That quote from Ectra Conla, or The Adventures of Conla the Fair, is referring to the same Con of the 100 Battles that we saw in our last episode on the kingship of Tara and sovereignty goddesses and all those other motifs that came into this idea of sacred kingship. And I think it's a nice bridge to our upcoming episode, or our episode today, on the coming of the faith, the arrival of Christianity in Ireland, because it anticipates this idea that Christianity is coming even as far back as Con's time. And if you'll recall, last episode, Con Céad or Con of the 100 Battles, he is supposed to have lived around the year 150. And Patrick, who we are going to meet in this episode, St. Patrick, does not arrive until the 400s. So there is an otherworld figure in this text, Ectra Conla, the Adventure of Conla. This figure warns Con that he should not cling to Druidry, he should not cling to paganism, because this righteous one is coming. And who is this righteous one? It is Patrick. This is being anticipated in this legendary text centuries before Patrick's actual arrival is supposed to take place. The rest of the quotes in this episode, just to anticipate this going forward, are from one of two authors, either Ludwig Bieler for the sections on Murchu and Tirachan's texts on Patrick, or from Padraig McCarthy for the extracts from Patrick's Confessio, or his confession. And we'll talk more about those texts as we move forward, and who these people are and what they're talking about in their texts. There is a genre of medieval writings known as hagiography. And this is a word that we've mentioned a few times here and there. It refers to texts which are usually called vitae in Latin, meaning lives in English. And it would be the vita of so-and-so. These are the supposed lives of saints. They tend to be very colorful. They tend to be written oftentimes a good while after the saint's actual death. And so how much of them is true and how much of them is legend is, like in many of the stories we've looked at, a matter of some doubt. There are certain things that we can be pretty sure didn't happen. There are times when we can be pretty sure that the actual history being reported is correct. So it's a genre we have to be careful with, but it is a genre that's very interesting and differs from the previous legendary material we've looked at in that its focus is a Christian one. We're going to look at one of the earliest, perhaps the earliest, piece of hagiography to originate in Ireland that we still have extant today. That is a life or vita of Patrick written by a monk named Murchu. And it's quite rare that we have the name of the composer, but interestingly, in the case of Patrick's two earliest lives, the life by Murchu and the life by Tirachan, both of these lives, both of these vitae, we have the names of their authors and we know a little bit about them. But we are going to focus today on the content of these texts, noting only that Murchu's Life of Patrick was written somewhere in the 7th century, which would be a good 2 centuries after Patrick's death, and Tyrconn's text seems to have been composed about 50 years after Murchu's. In this Vita Sancti Patrici, or Life of Patrick, we get an anecdote in which Patrick is at Tara. We're going to talk about how Patrick gets to Ireland because he's not from Ireland later in the episode. But in this particular scene, section 15 in the Vita Sancti Patrici, Patrick is at a hilltop near Tara. Some of the sources identify this as the Hill of Slain. And he lights a fire to celebrate the eve of Easter. It just so happens that at the same date, there is a pagan celebration being held at Tara that forbids fires. King Loigra of Tara sees Patrick's fire across the way on this other hill. And of course, since he has forbidden fires, he is very upset about this. And to make it even worse, his druid gives him a dire warning. Quote,
"Unless this fire is extinguished on this same night on which it has been lit, it will never be extinguished at all. He who has kindled it on this night will overpower us all and you, and will seduce all the people of your kingdom, and all kingdoms will yield to it, and it will spread over the whole country and will reign in all eternity."
Patrick and his entourage are summoned to meet the king. Patrick and the king's druids debate with each other on religious matters, and Patrick calls upon God and kills one of them who blasphemes against Christianity. That druid, through this prayer and God's power, is thrown into the air and dropped to his death. When Loigra's court attempt to strike back, Patrick summons a great darkness and an earthquake and flees with his followers in the form of deer so that they can escape detection. Patrick then returns to Tara the next morning, back in his human form, and this, of course, being Easter Day, and he enters a series of challenges to prove that his faith surpasses that of the Druids. The first unofficial challenge is that Patrick is invited to drink with the court of Loigra, and one of the Druids poisons Patrick's drink. Patrick, however, prays to God over his drink, and this freezes the liquor inside, so that when he overturns his cup, the liquor stays inside, but the poison, which has not been frozen like the drink itself, drips out. Once the poison is gone, Patrick turns the cup back right, prays again, the liquor melts, and he's able to drink it safely. The official challenges start after that in what's very much a magic showdown. A druid says to Patrick, "Hey, look what I can do," and uses a spell to blanket the plains around Tara in snow. Patrick kind of goes, "Ooh, impressive," but it's spring, and that's not super helpful for the whole agricultural cycle. In fact, that's going to inconvenience a lot of people, so why don't you remove that snow now? And the druid said something to the effect of, "Well, I've used up all my magic for the day, so I can't do that until tomorrow." Patrick goes, "Okay," and he prays to God, and the snow disappears. This pattern is repeated when a second druid comes up and invokes demons to summon a great fog over the land instead. Almost the exact same interaction occurs. Patrick says, "Cool, but this is really not helpful to anyone. Why don't you get rid of it?" And the druid says, "Can't until tomorrow." So Patrick prays the fog away. Finally, King Loigra is getting the idea that, this is not going so well. Let's try something a little different. So with the third druid, a trial by fire is arranged, in which Loigra's people build a two-sided house. In one side of the house will be the druid, in the other will be one of Patrick's followers. Then they're going to set the house on fire, And whoever comes out of the fire unscathed is clearly the one whose religion is correct. But the pagans are not going to be fair about this. They're not going to leave it all up to providence and religion, because they build the house with green wood, with nice moist wet wood that's not going to burn very easily on the side that their guy will stand in, and they use nice dry seasoned wood that's going to go up with no problem into flame on the side that Patrick's man is supposed to go into. So the representatives, which are a druid on one side and a follower of Patrick named Meningus on the other, they go into their respective sides and they're wearing each other's ceremonial garments. The druid is wearing a chasuble, an overcloak piece that belongs to Patrick or Meningus, and Meningus is wearing a equivalent piece from the druid. Well, Patrick prays as they set the two-sided house aflame, and through his prayers, it is the druid who, in the green side of the house, is consumed by fire, and Meningus who is unharmed. Not only that, the chasuble that the druid wore that belonged to Patrick's people does not burn up with the druid himself, while the druid's chasuble or equivalent garment is consumed by the flames, even though Meningus is unharmed. This reminds me very much of the last episode, in which we had a two-sided house at Tara. Cormac MacArt, who was not yet then king, made a true judgment against the false judgment made by the previous king Lugath. When this happened, the side in which the false judgment was given collapsed, while the side in which the true judgment was made remained standing. And this was that whole story that justified the name of the sloping ditches of Tara. That true judgment is what gave Cormac the sovereignty, gave him the kingship, instead of the previous false judgment king Lugath. Well, in the case of Patrick, we seem to have a very parallel motif, and Patrick has given what is essentially a true judgment. His religion is the true one, and so it is his side of the house where the inhabitant goes unharmed. This is essentially, by this comparison, showing that this ordeal by fire secures symbolic sovereignty for Christianity over King Loigra, or sovereignty of Christianity over paganism. Let's compare this story of the druid which blasphemed against Christianity in Murchu's text, who was thrown in the air and then dashed to the ground, with the scene in Tirchun's slightly later life of Patrick. Tirchun says, quote,
"And Patrick raised his hands to God because of the druid Lochlethenius, or Lochru, and said, 'My lord, cast out from my presence this dog, who barks at your face and at me. May he go to his death.' And all saw the druid being lifted up through the darkness of night almost to the sky. And when he came down again, his body, frozen with hailstones and snow mixed with sparks of fire, fell to the ground in the sight of all. And the druid's stone is in the southeastern parts of Tara to the present day, and I have seen it with my own eyes."
So this is really interesting. In Murchu's episode, we glossed over this fairly briefly, but there was a debate Patrick was having with Loigra's druids. One of them said something too blasphemous for Patrick. He prayed to God. God lifted the druid in the air, and the druid crashed to the ground and died. This seems to be the same druid. This seems to be telling the same story, but it is a much more colorful version, which is interesting because Tirchun's account is generally much more succinct than Murchu's. And in this account, the druid is essentially petrified. He's turned into stone, and there's this druid's stone that is left in the southeastern parts of Tara to the present day, according to Tirchun. This really resonates with, even though it's a different name, it resonates with that whole Bloch and Blugna stone or druid idea that we saw in the previous episode. So we get this happening again in not only a legendary source, but now also in a hagiographical text, with this confusion between druids and stones. One thing that we see happening with these traditions over time is that they change. And of course they do. As hundreds of years are passing, we get new takes on things like the story of St. Patrick, and in patrician hagiography, we get generally great expansions on these relatively short texts by Murchu, and even shorter with Tirichan. So to give you just one example of how these texts evolve over time, in later lives of Patrick, we get depictions, for example, in the Betha Fodrig, the tripartite life of Patrick, and in Jocelyn of Furness's life of Patrick. We get Lochra, this druid, flying under his own power or through infernal powers, with the powers of demons or the powers of pagan evil magic. And so he's flying around to show off how great he is and how great the pagan religion that he follows is. And in this case, it's not Patrick's power that raises him into the air. Instead, Patrick simply prays and the flight stops working. And Lochra is so high in the air when his infernal flight ceases to function that he falls to his death. So in many ways, this paints Patrick as an even more saintly figure. He is stopping the evil magic that Lochra has unleashed himself, and it's really Lochra's own fault that he falls to his death in these later tales. But those don't have the nice, fun connection to stones with druids, so, you win some, you lose some.
King Loigra summoned his elders and his whole council and said to them, "It is better for me to believe than to die." And having held council, acting on the advice of his followers, he believed on that day and became converted to the Lord, the eternal God, and many others believed on that occasion. And Holy Patrick said to the king, "Since you have resisted my teaching and been offensive to me, the days of your own reign shall run on, but none of your offspring shall ever be king."
This is an extremely common type of curse or divine punishment that Patrick lays upon those who offend him in some way or who offend his faith, his God. He will not only bring down some sort of retribution upon the offender, but also upon that offender's descendants. So here we see him saying to Loigra that none of your children will ever be king again. And we see this happen again and again, not only in the early lives, but also in later ones. As we move forward into future episodes, particularly after we finish this next set of episodes about writing, we're going to start looking at what the early medieval society in Ireland looked like and how it functioned, what its laws were, what the social hierarchy was like. And we're going to see that one really important aspect of that society and how it functioned was the idea of inheritance and the idea of your dervina, your family, your closest relations, and how these are inextricably linked to your economic prospects, not so much as an individual, but as a family unit, and not so much within a single lifetime, but generally over 3 generations is how a lot of the legal system functioned, how a lot of the ability to build prosperity within a family came about was over generations, not within just a single lifetime. The idea then that Patrick is, and other saints actually in Ireland, are regularly punishing not only the offender but also their families makes a lot more sense through this perspective. Perhaps in about a year's time, when the next St. Patrick's Day comes around, I can bring us all through an essay I wrote back during my master's program about divine retribution in the various lives of St. Patrick, and we can work through some more details of that type. So let's go ahead and turn to the actual history of what we know about the conversion of Ireland to Christianity. Because Patrick, as important as he was, wouldn't have converted the whole island single-handedly. We know that there was trade going on between Ireland and Christianized areas as early as the 1st century of the Common Era. We know there were imports of tin and wine, for instance, and exports of furs and hides and fish. There were contacts between Ireland and Roman Britain, and of course Roman Britain, this was a Rome that had been mostly Christianized, so there's this contact between Ireland and Christian Britain for centuries, and there continues to be some amount of connection with Christianity even after the fall of the Roman Empire. It seems very probable that there were Christian communities in Ireland before the fall of Roman Britain, given that there are Irish settlements in Britain in the same period.
I was taken into captivity in Ireland, along with thousands of others. We deserved this because we had gone away from God and did not keep his commandments. We would not listen to our priests, who advised us about how we could be saved. The Lord brought his strong anger upon us and scattered us among many nations, even to the ends of the earth.
Patrick is not originally from Ireland. According to his own description in the Confessio, which is a text which he supposedly penned himself, and most scholars seem to believe that this is in fact a text that Patrick did write. It's not some sort of forgery. Of course, we don't have the original copy, but we do have copies of that copy through the tradition of how manuscripts are copied and passed down. One of our earliest manuscript codices, which contains this text known as the Confessio, along with Murchu's Life of Patrick and Turchan's Life of Patrick, as well as one other text ascribed to Patrick known as the Letter to the Soldiers of Cariticus. All of these are contained in one place in the Book of Armagh. Armagh was the center of the cult of Patrick and was a very powerful Christian site during much of the Middle Ages. The whole idea of Patrick's hagiography, and hagiography in general, is that it was oftentimes used, if not most of the time used, to promote a particular saint's cult, and by extension promote particular monasteries or other ecclesiastical institutions associated with that saint. So the fact that Murchu and Turchan composed these Lives of Patrick about 200 years after Patrick's death suggests that they are really trying to promote particular sites associated with Patrick, and that they're trying to get a cult of Patrick going and trying to get pilgrimage, and through that trying to earn more income for the church and trying to earn more recognition. In this account from the Confessio, though, in Patrick's own writings, not in a legendary hagiographical text, Patrick tells us, just like in the hagiography composed by Murchu and Turchan, that he was originally taken into Ireland as a slave. And when he was taken, he says that this is because he was not a good Christian. It was a punishment that he deserved. Through his suffering as a slave, he learned to commune with God, and he learned to be a good believer, and that eventually helps him to escape from his captivity. His original home is not certain, but most people seem to associate or conclude that he is from somewhere in Wales.
Palladius, having been ordained by Pope Celestine, is sent as their first bishop to the Irish who believe in Christ.
This quote from Prospero Aquitaine in his Chronicle says that in 431, Palladius is sent to the Irish who believe in Christ. This, of course, suggests that there was a sufficient Christian population in Ireland to warrant a bishop, and also suggests that these Irish people, this Christian population, whoever they were, had contact with Rome. We know virtually nothing else about Palladius. He's actually treated as something of an embarrassment by later writers. And Patrick is traditionally said to arrive to Ireland in 432, but it's almost certainly the fact that down in the incontrovertible writings of Prosper of Aquitaine that we have this date of 431 for Palladius, and him being specifically said to be the first bishop in Ireland, that They chose 432 as a date to say, well, Patrick was just right after that. They can't say Palladius didn't come, but they can say Patrick was right after and he did a much better job. And so that seems to be what's going on here. It's unlikely that 432 is the exact date, even though Patrick does seem to have come sometime around then. As I was saying, we have a couple of surviving writings from Patrick. We have his Confessio, or Confession, and his letter to the soldiers of Coroticus, which is a much shorter text. These are dated in a fairly wide range, but somewhat specific at the same time, of 455 to 493. 493 is the later date at which Patrick is said to have died, and the earliest surviving manuscript containing these, as I mentioned, is the Book of Armagh, which is dated to 807, and this also contains the two earliest lives of Murchu and Tyrcon. All of these texts are available in both their original Latin as well as in an English translation at a very handy website called confessio.ie. No www, just the https:// confessio.ie. And you can access all these texts for yourself. And they're all relatively short and very readable, so I would recommend that people do check them out. According to the Confessio, Patrick first came to Ireland as a slave, taken from somewhere in Britain. He was not a good Christian at this time, even though his father was a deacon. As a slave, he was mainly assigned to look after livestock, and so he ended up spending a lot of time alone. And during all this alone time, he began to hear God's voice and to pray regularly. He escaped slavery after following a vision to seek out a ship that brought him back to Britain.
In a vision in the night, a man whose name was Victoricus, coming as it were from Ireland with so many letters they could not be counted. He gave me one of these, and I read the beginning of the letter, the voice of the Irish people. While I was reading out the beginning of the letter, I thought I heard at that moment the voice of those who were beside the wood of Fochlot, near the western sea. They called out as it were with one voice, "We beg you, holy boy, to come and walk again among us."
So, as Patrick tells us in this quote here, after returning to Britain, he eventually has this dream or this vision where this man named Victoricus tells him that he's being asked to come back to Ireland. The people there need him, they want him to bring Christianity to them. He is compelled by this vision, and later hagiographers tend to turn Victoricus into an angel. This is an angelic visitation, though Patrick does not specifically call Victoricus an angel himself.
However ignorant I am, God has heard me, so that in these late days I can dare to undertake such a holy and wonderful work. In this way I can imitate somewhat those whom the Lord foretold would announce his gospel in witness to all nations before the end of the world. This is what we see has been fulfilled. Look at us. We are witnesses that the gospel has been preached right out to where there is nobody else beyond.
This idea that there's no one else beyond where Patrick is Christianizing, this idea that Ireland is the westernmost edge of the Christian world, is a strong one that lasts throughout the early Middle Ages, if not longer. The idea that Patrick has gotten to the last people who have yet to be Christianized, in completing that process, he's basically getting the world ready for the Last Judgment. He's getting the world ready for its end, because once God's word has been spread to the whole world, well, there's no reason to keep the world going anymore, I guess. So there's a very doomsday aspect to a lot of what Patrick is telling us and to a lot of what he seemed to believe. In fact, there's a related tradition, or a patrician tradition, that says that Patrick asks God that in exchange for Christianizing the Irish, Christianizing this last group of people on earth, that God does the Irish the mercy of submerging the entire land of Ireland under the sea 7 years before the Last Judgment.
I pray for those who believe in and have reverence for God. Some of them may happen to inspect or come upon this writing which Patrick, a sinner without learning, wrote in Ireland. May none of them ever say that whatever little I did or made known to please God was done through ignorance. Instead, you can judge and believe in all truth that it was a gift of God. This is my confession before I die.
As opposed to his hagiography, in which Patrick is depicted as a very powerful, very self-assured and confident man, his actual writings paint him as very meek and humble, and he is constantly being sure to ascribe all his successes to God. He is clearly a very learned man because he's able to compose this very impressive document, and a document that involves a lot of biblical references sprinkled throughout. But he says he is a sinner without learning. He doesn't seem to recognize himself as a great saint. And so we get this very different depiction, almost like a superhero of the Middle Ages in the hagiography by comparison. To give a quick timeline overview of what we have then, we seem to have Pope Celestine I sending Palladius as the, quote, first bishop of the Irish believers in Christ, end quote, to Ireland in 431. According to the traditional hagiographical date of Patrick's arrival in Ireland, Patrick arrives in 432 from Britain. There is a view of modern historians that thinks it's something more like 455 is a more realistic date for his arrival. We know that in 444, we have the traditional date of the first Irish bishopric in Armagh, which again is this site where we have so much patrician connections, the center of Patrick's cult. And then in 457 or 461 or 462 or 493, depending on the tradition you go by, Patrick dies. So it's a little uncertain exactly how long he was knocking around doing his Christianizing mission, but it seems to have been somewhere between 25 years and perhaps 40 some years. Other saints from the early medieval period, besides Patrick, who's most closely associated with Armagh, are the so-called fathers of Irish monasticism, Saint Enda of the Aran Islands, who is said to have been around circa 450 to 530. We have Saint Finian of Clonard and Skellig Michael. Skellig Michael, one of the great, very unique island monasteries with this lovely beehive structures upon it on a very difficult to get to little island off the west coast of the country. And St. Finian was supposed to be around circa 470 to 549. Then we have St. Ciaran or St. Ciaran of Clonmacnoise, circa 516 to 49. We have one of the big ones besides Patrick, St. Columcille or St. Columba, who was around from 521 to 597, and those dates are a lot more precise compared to some of these other saints. And he is the patron saint of Durrow, Kells, and Derry in Ireland, but super importantly, also the saint of Iona, which is an island in Scotland and was a major center of learning and Christianity, and was really sort of the base from which Scotland was Christianized. And much like Patrick is oftentimes depicted as the single great force that Christianized Ireland, Columcille or Columba is depicted as the single great force that Christianized Scotland. Another very important early saint who has a lot of prominence here in Ireland is St. Bridget of Kildare, who is said to be around circa 524 to 528. In the last episode, I recommended a non-academic podcast, a very fun podcast called What the Folklore. In this episode, I want to take this opportunity, because I'm not saying very much about Bridget, to also recommend a much more academic podcast, but one that I still think is quite accessible, especially with the background we're providing in this episode, and that is the Medieval Irish History podcast out of Maynooth University here in Ireland. And specifically, I want to recommend their episodes they've done so far on these three major saints of Ireland. They did a podcast on St. Bridget with their guest, Catherine McKenna, Professor Catherine McKenna, back in the end of January, right before St. Bridget's Day on February 1st. And that was season 1, episode 5 of the Medieval Irish History podcast. They have also done an episode on Patrick, which goes into a lot more nitty-gritty stuff that we're not getting into today, but would be a really great follow-up to this episode if you wanted to go listen to it. I think you now have the background to understand what's going on in that episode, and that was their season 1, episode 8 with Terry O'Hagan, released on the 15th of March. And finally, they have done 2 episodes on St. Columba with Professor Thomas Owen Clancy, both in June. Those are season 1, episode 15 and episode, this says 18, but I think it's supposed to be 16, respectively. I'm looking at my podcast feed as I'm listing these off to you. So that is the Medieval Irish History podcast. Very good, highly recommend. It might be something that in general would be good to access after we get through season 1 of Fabula Celtica with the Ancient Ireland season, because they do just dive into some things here and there, assuming some prior knowledge that people who haven't done Celtic studies before might not have. So I do recommend them, but you could certainly at this point go and look at those Saints episodes, no problem at all. The earliest churches at this early date were mainly small buildings made of non-durable materials such as wood, wattle and daub, and earth. And so most of these tended not to last. They were generally too small to hold a full congregation within, so Mass would generally have been conducted outside. These primarily would have been sites for the priests to operate out of, with a handful of alleged exceptions, such as Kildare. Ireland became linked to the continent through this conversion, more so than it had been before, especially through contact with Rome. Whatever that connection was that brought Palladius to Ireland, to whatever small Christian population was there at the time, was very much strengthened as all of Ireland became Christianized and became interested in what the Catholic Church and the center of power of the Catholic Church had to say. This is also really the arrival of scholarship to Ireland and the arrival of writing. We see the earliest extant writing in Ireland, the Ogham or Ogham stones, which we're going to look at next episode, and we also see the beginning of manuscripts not too long after. Our oldest extant manuscript is dated to about the year 600. We'll also be looking at that in a future episode. Art evolved after this conversion, seeming to adapt from that earlier Latin style that began in the Iron Age and became influenced by Roman, Anglo-Saxon, and Pictish styles. The Picts being a group of possibly Celtic people, not entirely clear, who lived in the Scottish Highlands, and part of that group who Columba was trying to convert. As an example, one that's pretty famous that some people may already know what it looks like, they've come across a picture of it somewhere before, or they've seen it at the National Museum in Dublin, is the Tara brooch, which is dated to the 7th century. And if you have not seen the Tara brooch before, I do recommend you do a quick search to look it up. It is a gorgeous object, and you can see that Latin influence from the earlier period, but it's become much more elaborate. It's become something that would be not out of place in Rome. That sets us up for our next conversation, in which we are going to look at the early writing in Ireland. And we'll begin with an episode, which Michael is going to take the lead on, looking at Ogham or Ogham, the writing in stone that is our earliest extant native writing. Then we'll take a look at manuscript culture and some of the details of how that work, because that's really important context for understanding what is coming down to us in the manuscripts that are still around. And finally, we'll be looking at the law texts, which tell us so much important information about what early medieval society was like. So until then, see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Fabula Celtica
With Tyler Baxter
and Michael Frim. Follow us at Fabula Celtica on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky, or email us at fabulaceltica@gmail.com. And Patrick raised his hands to God because of the druid Lochlethenius. Oh, I'm going to start again. Lochlethenius?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh my. Lochru is so much easier.